I cannot hear you. Oh, share video. Oops. Hello. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
I'm good, and you?
How are you? Excellent, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad it's getting a little bit warmer. It's been like the Arctic, hasn't it? I'm just going to invite some people to our talk so they know it's on. Just a moment. Excellent. Okay, so we're starting in a couple of minutes. For those people that are joining us after our tech issue of last time, I now know what it was that was the problem. We've been having electricity surges, so the Wi-Fi has been affected by it, but hopefully it'll be sorted out soon. So Nancy, is this your first Instagram Live?
Yeah,
first but not the last,
I mean,
hopefully.
I really like the concept. Let's see. I'm not very good at talking live, so let's see.
Don't worry, don't worry. It takes a bit of practice, but you know, this is very relaxed and informal, and we can be assured that everyone tuning in is really into our subject matters. So at least I hope they are. If they're not when they start, then hopefully by the end of the talk they will be excited. So we're about to go live now. Great. So Nancy, I first of all just want to introduce you a little bit for the benefit of those that don't know you. You are an interdisciplinary designer. You are the co-founder of bioMATTERS, and you're also, would I be correct in saying, a senior lecturer at Central St Martin's? That's correct. And you're from the States, aren't you?
Yeah, yes. So,
you're from
then
Portugal.
I went to England to study, and then I went to the States. Yeah, now I'm in between the States and England. Yes.
Ah, so because there are quite a few people that have moved around in this field, I've noticed. We're quite a migratory collective, aren't we? Well, I've lined up some questions, Nancy. For the people that are joining us online, please do send your questions. I will see them pop up. There's a little area on this app where I can have a look and I can see if you've asked any questions, and we will try to fit them in. But to kick off, Nancy, how did you get involved with living systems, biodesign, and the biofields more generally?
I have been exploring, so I'm an architect. My background is architecture, and I've been exploring this conceptualization of living integrated design for almost 20 years now, I have to say. So it all started with my interest in computational design. So I come from this interest in computational design, digital design, and the whole thing started with cybernetics, really. You know, the science of communication and automated control systems in both machines and living things. So this is how I approach biodesign, how I started to think about biodesign, very much influenced by thinkers as cyberneticians like Gordon Pass, conversation theory, Gregory Bateson, ecological mind, and then architects that really started thinking about architecture as living systems, as mimicking artificial systems, and, you know, very much influenced by how do we create systems that react in real life, that have a conversation with the world, with the environment, with human beings, and how this notion of living materiality and living matter has been always present since this time when I started to build these artificial systems with these notions of networks, of feedback loops, this idea of responsiveness and interaction in real time. So very much influenced by John Fraser, our Architectural Association, when, you know, evolutionary architecture, this idea of morphogenesis, which is very much about generating form and looking at natural and biological systems. So this is how I started this is how I started thinking about biodesign, really.
And you know, that's interesting because, you know, those are all names that will be familiar to those that have studied architecture. And obviously at that time, I mean, when we look back to when they were practicing and to the groups that were working at that time, like Archigram, Cedric Price, really all of the ideas that we're working with today, again, Nicholas Negroponte, really all of that which we're working with today was very much foreseen at that time, and within and of this community that were looking at essentially information exchange, wasn't it? And they were looking at materiality, but in this way of temporality. They were looking at pop-up concepts, which though not new in the sort of the legacy of humankind and of architecture, were being in effect reintroduced, and so they seemed new. But of course, you know, we have moved on. You know, we've naturally started to look not at human systems, not at digitization, but we've realized, my goodness, there's all of this information exchange in the natural world. It's going all around us. And so I just wondered, I know in my work, one of the things that really inspires me and catalyzes new ideas is reading about the new discoveries, reading about what we've come to understand about plant networks, fungal networks, and, you know, really having my mind blown in a sense, that because the scale of this is so huge, isn't it, within the natural world?
Yes, I mean, it's
Do you
really
feel that way
difficult
too?
to wrap your mind around. And when you think about systems thinking, right, it's easy to say, right? So this idea of systems thinking, where a system is not just, you know, one thing, but it's a collection of things, and so it's a system of interconnected set of elements, right? That it's coherently organized. So it is kind of easy to say, but then to implement it, it's quite complex. And if you start thinking about interplanetary design and understanding ecosystems and understanding all these, you know, interconnections between living and non-living, so it is quite complex to think about. It's a really beautiful way of thinking, and this is very much at the core of, you know, how I teach and how I think about design. But yeah, I mean, it is difficult to then implement it. And you have to break it down, and then I think that's when you start thinking about and start developing your own workflows and how can I implement these ideas, right? So I think it's, you know, it's a way of, you know, it's a matter of you finding your own workflows and teaching your, you know, and breaking it down, and how can you achieve, because one thing is actually thinking about models, right? And I've been really influenced, and this is how I started thinking. I mean, okay, so how. And that's why I started, you know, reading about, you know, other thinkers. And for example, Maturana and Varela was super influential when I was doing my PhD, you know, autopoietic machines. I wrote a paper in 2002 towards a living architecture, where I read this parallel, which is a very abstract exercise, but I felt like I needed to. So, you know, really looking into autopoietic machines and then making a parallel to my design process, you know. So this is how I started. I felt the need to really read, you know, artificial life, systems theory, you know, and how we can start breaking it down and implementing a design process. So, you know, I mean, architecture for these people, Cedric Price, John Fraser, was very much seeing architecture as a form of artificial life.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I sort of really, I've been thinking about this a long time. My first inquiries into biomaterials were in the early 90s, which is a long time ago. But then it seemed so abstract. It was so far in the future that it didn't seem at all realistic to imagine such things as, you know, you could necessarily get research funding, let alone you can actually create a business. And, you know, going back to a dozen years ago, when I was thinking about things like, might we be able to create hybrid systems that splice electronic information with biological information? Again, you know, this was the stuff of Avatar, of James Cameron movies, and it seemed really out there. But in that last dozen years, when we looked to what's happening in the commercial sector, when we looked to startups and to research labs, we realized, well, actually, there are programs that are sensing what plants are signaling from the environmental changes. They're putting all of this together. They're splicing it with artificial intelligence. And in a way, I mean, it's even for people like us, you know, who've been reading about this, it almost feels surreal to see this coming online and to actually see this scaling. And so, you know, when I was thinking about how long it would take for these kind of systems to come into use within, you know, society as opposed to a lab, I was thinking maybe 2030, and now I think, goodness, was I a little bit conservative in that estimate? So it's quite incredible. How do you feel about the speed at which this is developing in terms of, you know, what we're capable of doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, of course, I think a lot about this because I teach and I have to, I mean, people are very curious about this. When is this last, okay, so there is a paradigm shift. We are really changing the paradigm of how we think and how we make. But how long is this going to take? I mean, I don't know. I mean, for me, I think it will take a generation of biodesigners. I think it will take 10 years for these biodesigners to come out of school and really start changing the industry. You know, changing the industry means inventing new machines, new manufacturing processes. The society is going through a lot of change. I mean, women, women a lot. Okay, humans are. We are shifting, you know, technology is shifting and making this change. I mean, climate change is something that, I mean, it's crazy to think that 5 years ago, there was no data, clear data about climate change. We didn't have this data. So now it's, you know, nobody can doubt it. I mean, it's there, we have the numbers. But so, okay, we have the data, but then changing things from a fossil fuel, you know, world and industry, it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, there's a lot of things that in the machine that have to change. I mean, politically, you know, for example, there is a need for massive political change, you know, implementing codes, implementing laws, implementing. So I think for me, it changes. I mean, it will take one generation of biodesigners for us to generate these biodesigners. And then in 10 years time, I think things will really kick off, I think. So this is how I think and I project. We have to project these things. There is a high, I mean, of course, there's a high degree of uncertainty, but I mean, for us educators, we have to project. So I think it will take, you know, 10 years, one generation of biodesigners coming out of school and start practicing. A decade.
A decade. I mean, it feels to me that there's almost a polarization at present, because for a long time we were seeing a lot of progress. We were seeing advancement towards pay equality, or at least we seem to, and gender equality and diversity more generally. And within sort of broader society, we went from sustainability being an add-on, being something that companies weren't necessarily working with, to now everybody wants to have not just a sort of sustainability manager, but a sustainability chief officer, department, and so forth. So we've got that happening on the one hand. And then if we look at what's happening geopolitically in Britain, in France, obviously what's going on in you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's the extreme conservative coming back, sort of having this, you know, the sort of a community, as it were, that reject all of these things that our community embrace, all these new ideas. And it feels like a real wrestling of ideologies. And I think it is unpredictable and it's interesting. But when I look at somewhere like Ukraine, I mean, it's an absolute tragedy for us to see these essentially cities being razed to the ground. But then I think, well, if, as I hope, Ukraine wins this war, what I know of Ukraine, what I know of the peoples of Ukraine, I know they have some of the best tech minds in the world, some of the best cyberneticians. They are very progressive and very forward thinking. And I think, you know, although it's an absolute tragedy to see the heritage architecture being destroyed, I'm also thinking, well, you know, it would be interesting to see what comes and replaces that. Because if any nation is going to embrace new ideas and to, you know, look at how new ideologies and new concepts can actually rebuild, it strikes me it might be that. And so it does feel a very dynamic time, and it's hard to tell quite what will happen. But you know, we can obviously look back at some of the sort of the precedents. Obviously, some of the most inspired thinking about what our future might be has come from very turbulent times, hasn't it? If we think about what the sort of the Cedric Prices and the Gordon Frasers and what have you, they were living in the time when the Cold War, a nuclear bomb could drop on top of you, weren't they? So they were thinking very, very radically. And I don't know, do you know if, I mean, I've read some of their writings, but I'm not sure if did they ever speak to the possibility of sort of, if you like, annihilation of architecture and the
Definitely. I think
rebirthing of it?
Architects are always very political anyway. And I think, you know, innovation in architecture was very political, driven by political agendas, you know, very much so. And I think, you know, I think designers concerned with sustainability need to consider why is it that ecological sustainability is so difficult in the current political context, you know? Why is it that the case? And I think the big thing is about that I can do as an educator is about ecological literacy, because, you know, it informs the debate on sustainability by emphasizing, you know, the contextual and the collective nature of sustainability, civilization over time. And I think this is very important for students and for me. You know, we need to look back and understand why did we arrive where we arrived. So I think it's very important. And what you just said, it's a shame what's going on in the world, and it's very tragic. And with what everything has been happening, not just climate crisis, but, you know, politically. But it's an opportunity, like you say. You know, sustainability is not the feature of one product. You know, it is the condition of an entire culture relative to its gross impact on ecological systems. So we are very aware of that, and it's very difficult to change and to measure. But, you know, environmental problems are also political problems, and so the political economy of design matters. And so economical priorities have a determining role in the degree of which how design can be addressed ecologically, you know, in terms of prioritizing, you know, and strategizing design. So designers concerned with sustainability need to consider why is it that, you know, it's so difficult to change with, you know, these political systems we have, and how can we change? I mean, it's always about changing systems, which is really hard. But I think, you know, it is important to think about, you know, societies, to think about exactly
the bigger dynamics of what's going on.
Just shows how entangled, you know, the whole thing is: economics, politics, and design, and our responsibility.
And you know, in a sense, it strikes me that because, you know, yourself and myself and the community that we work with, it's inherent to what we do to acknowledge that there is intelligence, there is agency, there is value, in effect, in the in other species' way of dealing with data. We respect the fact that a fungal network or a bacterium or some other microorganism can sometimes work out problems that we as humans are trying to work out better than we can. And actually, in the case of slime mold, and particularly, I think some of the work that Claudia Pasquero and Marco Paletto and their team at Ecological Studio are doing, they actually, you know, these microorganisms, very simple organisms, can actually compute that in a more intelligent way than we can, and with a fraction of the resources. That to us is a natural concept. We don't even, you know, it's not even something that is sort of intellectually challenges us. It fits with our ideology. But in a sense, that's Absolutely. A radical act in itself, isn't it? To acknowledge that it's not just we as humans that are intelligent, or a particular group of humans, but intelligence is all around us, if only we can access it and use it in some way.
I mean, it's the whole changing of the paradigm, you know, from the instrumentalization of human-nature relationships, right? The way we've been really thinking about these things, where natural processes are controlled and exploited, from, you know, acknowledging this intelligence, and how then now we are embedding them and bringing them into the process, into this collaboration. That's what I think is very exciting about biodesign. You know, it's just about integrating and doing, you know, bacterial cellulose, and it's about the whole new way of thinking about design processes, about this hybrid, you know, discipline. So it is a very exciting moment, I think, for educators. I believe so, you know.
Yeah. And thinking about Central St. Martin's, I mean, Central St. Martin's is one of the institutions. In fact, it's probably the first institution that I would think of if someone asked me to name an academic institution that actually encourages its students to think about these issues and to question policy, because ultimately, as we all know, we're beholden to policy, whereas a lot don't. And, you know, it strikes me as not coincidental that St. Martin's, certainly within the biodesign sphere, is an epicenter of excellence. There's no doubt about it. Your institution has not one, but, you know, a whole department, in effect, really pioneering this space. And you are very much leading, you know, worldwide, aren't you? So, yes, it seems to me that there is synergy here. And that's something that I think we should expand on in another conversation. So I just wanted to know a bit more, and I'm sure others do as well. In the course of your research and your practice, both at bioMATTERS and your various projects, because you are a folio practitioner, aren't you? You've got a number of different activities going on. What have you found to be the most challenging thing about working with living systems, computationally, materially?
Yes, I had to actually Google what folio professional was.
It does what it says on the tin.
That's good to know. That's one, yeah, I can say that now. But so, yes, so I've been always an educator, but the only challenging things for me is about, I am an educator in terms of time. So I have a full time as an educator. So this is my #1 job. But so the challenge for me is that it leaves me very little time, zero time for my practice, which I love, because I like to think that I am a designer and a maker. And I believe that's a great combination. You know, being a maker, a designer, as an educator, for me is super rewarding, because my pedagogy and my practice benefit from this. So, you know, they feed off each other. And that's, I think, really good for my students and for the course that I'm shaping at Biodesign, because I have hands-on experience. So I work with these systems. I know how difficult it is. I know the challenges, and therefore I can teach it. And my students give me a lot, you know, I learn a lot from them. I love the environment. My colleagues teach me a lot. Central San Martins is a great place, super creative. So for me, this is perfect. Then the problem is time, right? So that's my main challenge. How do I find time for these things to happen? So I do it because I sacrifice a lot of my personal time and, you know, my personal life. Big sacrifices I've been doing in my career. And this is a big thing for to talk about today, you know, because women sacrifice a lot of their time. So work and life balance is really complicated in an architectural world, in the industry. And I think we need to change that. So for me, this is an opportunity for changing that. We need to find time. We need to have a normal life, because architects are very dysfunctional people, you know. It's a very dysfunctional world. It's a very dysfunctional way of life. And so this needs to change, you know. Women need to have time to have children, to enjoy life, you know. So not just that, you know, it doesn't to do with, but it has to do with life, how do you say, balancing this work and life. So this is a big topic at the moment, I have to say, in architecture. And this is maybe one of the reasons why I went into education. It was a very male, white, dominant environment. And so, yeah.
I think, I think what you're saying very much resonates with me. And I can think, when I think to most of the women that I know, not just in the areas that we work, but in creative arts and creativity and in science, many of them have made absolutely enormous sacrifices. They have really had to work incredibly hard. It reminds me a lot of in the startup community. Again, I've worked in commercial as well, and I've been in a number of investor pitches, both projects I've worked on and projects that others have worked on. And I've seen firsthand that it is a lot harder for women to pitch for funding. The kind of things that typically come up are, firstly, I find that women's experience tends to be overlooked, or it tends not be taken as seriously. Even if a woman pitches and she's got a very robust CV and she's done a huge amount of due diligence and she's prototyped and she's tested and she's got basically what she needs to show that what she's doing will work, she is far less likely to get funding. On the flip side of that, I've seen really most of the male startup entrepreneurs I know, when they have pitched, even if they literally have got little more than the back of the beer mat idea, they haven't actually researched it, they have no idea who their competitors are, let alone have actually scoped out meaningful figures. it's actually rare that they don't get funding, or that they don't at the very least get another opportunity. I think my experiences of funding for research haven't been much different. And that, for me, you know, on the one hand, I know it's been a lot harder. I know I've had to clock in up to 110-hour weeks sometimes. And, you know, at one point in my life, it got to the stage I had to stop because I was getting physically ill from actually being, you know, putting so much in. But when in some respects, when I look back, I realized what it's done for me is it's forced me to be highly creative in how I launch projects, because I don't have the luxury that a lot of men have. I don't have the knowledge that my odds of getting investment funding are very good. I know that if I were to pitch for research funding, the statistics aren't working for me. And I think it is a massive issue. And it really saddens me that the generation of students now are even facing this. I thought this would be done and dusted by the time you and I and our peers were where we are, but it's still a huge problem. And you know, as you say, it does need to be spoken about. It does need to be addressed, because if we can't actually change this, all that's going to happen is a repeat of the past, wherein we see a huge amount of female talent doesn't get the opportunities and have to make the kind of sacrifices that our generation have, which, you know, I think like you, I mean, I don't like to have regrets, but I'm certainly very conscious of the things I've sacrificed. So that's a really important point you've made there, and I'm really, really grateful to you that you've made it, Nancy. So next question. As an architect, an educator, co-founder, like many that have worked in this community, you have juggled a lot of projects, and you've already spoken to the fact that it is hard as an academic, you know, as someone that is working in education, as principally an educator, to actually juggle all of these things. Apart from sacrificing and making those hard choices, have you found, if you like, any tips, any techniques that you find help you and that you would recommend to others?
I think, you know, I think that's one of the, I think designers are very passionate people. They are very curious about the world. Actually, I think that's something we really share with scientists. I have to say, I was thinking a lot about these things. I think both designers and scientists, we share, you know, a high curiosity, you know, levels around the world that surrounds us. So I think, you know, having this passion, I think this is something that everybody says, but I think the tips is really loving what you do, and it's super, super passionate, and not be afraid of making mistakes, you know, just getting your hands dirty. I mean, this looks like I'm talking to my students now, but this is what I tell my students all the time, you know, just do it. Just don't overthink it. Just go for it. I mean, really, this is my number one advice, you know, be brave. Don't overthink it. If that's what you want to do, just go for it, and just, yeah, be brave, be passionate. I think that's really what's the most important thing in life, you know. Take risks.
I agree with that. And you actually, one of the things that strikes me, you know, certainly in older generations and in some education systems around the world, there's this idea that there are very definitive lines between subjects, but actually some of the processes that you use as a scientist are exactly the same as a designer. You're seeing it through a different lens because you have your intention is a slightly different outcome, but effectively when it comes to research, you're doing a lot of the same things. You are experimenting. You have to go through that due diligence process, and it strikes me as it's almost an artificial boundary. And I sometimes think that, I mean, I see a lot of a lot of creative people that are incredibly good scientists, and they don't even realize it. And on the flip side of that, I can think of a number of very good scientists, like Professor Rachel Armstrong. She is an absolutely stunning, she's a world-class science fiction author. She's actually an incredibly good illustrator. She's really she's a polymath. She can do both. She'd never admit it. She'd never sort of speak to that, but she can. And it strikes me that, being brave and really sort of going for it, because everybody has to learn, don't they? Everybody's got to learn through their mistakes. So I think what you're speaking to is just don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of the labels and just give it a go. If it doesn't work out, use the experience to do something else. You know, that's how it is, isn't it?
Rachel Armstrong. I think scientists are super creative. I mean, that's what we share a lot. We are both very creative. We share this, you know, deep interest around curiosity. You know, curiosity is super important. But also, I think people, well, I see that with my students a lot. They become little scientists and then they are afraid of experimenting. So, you know, this leap of faith that I constantly talk about with my students, you have to allow yourself and embrace uncertainty. And you have to, you know, design is a messy process. It's a non-linear, you know, messy thing, you know. You have to go into this discovery mode and it will be amazing. You have to find the system. And once you find the system, it's like, you know, magic starts to happen, you know. And so what I do the most of my time as an educator, what I really try to do, and the important thing to do, is to get the students into this, you know, a confidence mode where you just have to jump into the unknown and find your, you know, whatever works for you. You have to make it your own. You have to find your own path. You have to find, you know, and this is where magic happens, you know, it's like a miracle. But so, yeah, I mean, you talked about, yeah, I think the challenge here is finding people that want to do both things, you know. So the tricky thing is, for me, the challenging thing is, how do we find the people that are comfortable bridging both science and design? This is my number one challenge, because it's not easy to find, I have to say. It's not easy to find. So we have very good designers, you have very good scientists. Yeah. And then there are this space in the middle where people have to come together and they have to be comfortable bridging these two worlds. And so finding these translators, you know, these translators that can communicate in a very easy to understand ways is where, you know, I find the challenge, you know, is where it's difficult to get this, you know, interdisciplinary team. And I've been making this team at St. Martin's, that we are on our third year. We have amazing people that can, you know, but it's not easy to find. I mean, you need the special people to do this and to allow these two voices to emerge and create something new. What I'm most proud of, you know, at St. Martin's. This is what I'm most proud of, because we are not doing plug and play. We are not doing plug and play of traditional ways of thinking into enforcing things. We are not doing that. And this takes a lot of time, you know, to have, you know, something that emerges, that you write a design brief that is a hybrid brief, you design a set of deliverables that are again, you know, hybrid. It just takes a lot of compromise, you know, and invention and creativity. And this is what's the most exciting thing that I like, you know, is to have these conversations and work side by side with scientists. But they have to be special scientists and they have to be special designers, I have to say, you know.
Do you feel, you know, when I think back, I'm sounding ancient now, but when I think back to my school years, I was given, you know, I was equally comfortable in academia and I was equally comfortable in the arts, but I wanted to go to art school. That was my ambition. I had no ambition at all at that stage to go and study books and be scholarly as such. I just wanted to mess around in art studios. And I was given a very definitive choice on my A-levels and, you know, the rest of it. It was you choose one or you choose the other. And effectively, I had to give up science. And so I did what I think a lot of people in our field have done, is I hacked the system. And that, you know, when I went to university, I mean, I was doing an interdisciplinary degree, but it wasn't so interdisciplinary that I could study design and science. I was studying different kinds of design. And so I set up a mini lab in my bedroom, my student hall's bedroom, which wasn't a good idea because I was burning plastics and I was, you know, I had chemicals and God knows what in there. It's really a good job I didn't accidentally arson the building. So I wouldn't recommend it at all, but I kind of hacked the system because at that time I couldn't, there was no other way I could pursue both. And I do, you know, I'd like to think that the education system has moved on from that now, but it sounds to me that if you're struggling to find interdisciplinary you know, not experts, but talent really to populate this team, that it must surely have something to do with that, because we're not inherently, you know, good at just one sort of artificially defined discipline and, you know, really good at one and then really bad at another. As humans, we are fairly adaptable and, you know, yes, some people have strengths and others, you know, not, but it strikes me that there's the education system below the universities perhaps needs a bit of a rethink. Would you say that, or do you think there's another reason why it's hard to find the sort of the interdisciplinary practitioner?
Education, you know, we have silos. So we have engineers, you know, we have architects, we have designers, and we have artists, and we have, so everything is siloed, you know. There are very little opportunities for interchange. And so actually in the US, I have to say, education is much more open. So we have many opportunities to do what they call it, extracurricular activities. They have a name for these kinds of modules where you can basically, you open your course to other courses in the university, and they can come. You have engineers, you have artists that come and take your course. So you work with, you know, multidisciplinary environment with lots of different students, and that's great. So in Europe, it's still very structured. I mean, in continental Europe, the way I was, you know, educated, it was completely siloed. We only saw architects. I mean, it was just, so I think it is an issue of education. And I think it's really opening up. And now, you know, interdisciplinarity is something that everybody is embracing. But one thing is just saying, I mean, this happens with, you know, environmentally conscious design. Everybody's talking about it, sustainable design, but then actually having wet labs, you know, working with scientists side by side, you know, it's still very small, a small number of courses that are doing that. So we are lucky that Central St. Martin's, we are doing that. There are other schools that are also doing that. But so I think it gradually, it will change. And I think education is definitely changing, and education changing, societies will change. So this is what I was saying about this decade that we have to, you know, it's a transitional moment. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, my life, and this is what I tell my students, I mean, I do everything in my experiments. This is how I started. You know, I didn't have a lab. I did it in my kitchen. I did, you know, steel air boxes. I didn't have a flow hood. I mean, I still do that, you know, sometimes. In our studio, we have finally a flow hood, but, you know, a lot of time it was just me doing, you know, sterilized work in a steel air box. And this is what I think, you know, people have to realize. You can't wait for your ideal, you know, conditions and having a wet lab in your studio to start working with living systems. There's a lot of things you don't need a sterilized environment. So it is actually really easy, and all these material is online. You can learn everything on your own, and then that's how you start. You know, you don't really need to have a scientist, to be honest. You can start learning on your own.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess that's the challenge, isn't it? Because when you're pioneering, when you're genuinely doing something that is right at the edge, it's the new frontier of whatever it is, there will not be that infrastructure. And by the time that infrastructure is in place, I mean, I'm thinking here, you know, wouldn't it be fantastic? I don't know if there is one, but to have, instead of just an art and design foundation or a sciences foundation, to have an art, science, STEAM foundation course where it is all mixed up, and that is running at all the top colleges, and that brings together all the expertise, not necessarily to produce an individual who is equally as talented as a scientist or as a designer, but that feels very comfortable in both those worlds, and that is therefore able, if nothing else, to speak the language of these different areas, because the language is very different and some of the cultures are different. So creating that, but then again, I guess the irony is probably by the time the course is built and funded, there'll be something else that we need to develop because the creative community, you know, that's what we do, isn't it? We're always pushing it forward. There's never, you know, we're never actually happy with the system. That's one of the reasons that we do what we do, because we're challenging it. So it's yeah, I think change needs to come, but I guess as it's, I mean, I'm trying to think of any creative or scientist of past that's had the ideal conditions, and I don't think I can think of any. I mean,
and I think that's why it's so important.
Can you?
And, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to criticize this new generation too much, I have to say. But, you know, if you look at the greatest designers in history, you know, and the greatest artists in history, I mean, I say this to my students all the time. You come to me with one drawing and one model. You need to produce 50 models. That's how you have to do it. You have to produce a series because, you know, think about, you know, the big Jackson Pollock. I mean, he perfected his technique for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. He was doing that obsessively, you know, over and over and over and over again. And I think you know, this is how you have to approach it. If you really, really are passionate about, you know, you have to think that this is just the start of your journey. You know, it's taking me 20 years now, and I've been thinking about the same thing and trying things in different ways. Either I do it with sensors, with actuators, now I do it with living systems, now I do it with everything at the same time. So, you know, it just takes time, you know, it takes time to perfect your craft, to hone your craft, and you have to be willing to do that, you know. So
absolutely. And it strikes me that you have to put that time in, because again, if it is that new, then you really are building it foundations upwards, aren't you? You've got to put every brick in place. You can't just magic it up. Or if you do magic it up, I mean, I think in architecture, one of the sort of tragedies almost of architecture is that for all the incredible things that you can do with digital, you know, and it has its many important uses, of the past decade, particularly in the future space, we've seen a lot of CGI generated imagery that looks very glossy. It's always an architectural concept drenched in the sun, and it's rarely, if ever, it's sort of, there's a futuristic style, which is actually it's a language that is now very old. I mean, it's you know, I'm talking about the sort of the skyscrapers, the cement, the glass, which is some of the newer incarnations of it just have the same narrative, but they stick trees on it. So they wallpaper it in green. And it's so incredibly superficial. And I think, you know, it's such a shame that there's such emphasis on CGI now, because really, you know, architecture is not just, it's not about creating the pictures. It's actually about creating the construct, the idea. And that's really everything that the people you were speaking to earlier, the pioneers of cybernetics, the you know, the great sort of thinkers, particularly of the 1960s and 70s, they, you know, yes, they created some great imagery, but that was to communicate great ideas. They weren't creating imagery for its own sake, were they?
I mean, all these people, they were really the ecological pioneers, you know, in the 60s. That, you know, it was very, it was very driven by changing the world and the need to change the world. And so we are now witnessing a new incarnation of that through, you know, biotechnologies and science, but also, the digital world is definitely something that, that you just said. It has, I mean, it kind of dates with, I think, with everything, but parametric design. I mean, it's the obsession with aesthetics, I think, you know, and how we are always looking for the next thing, I guess. But definitely there is this new aesthetic, living aesthetic, that it is quite exciting in my view. I mean, I love it. I mean, I'm fascinated by it in my work. You know, we are using computational design to mimic biological systems, and I mean, it's a fetish. We are fetishized by it. I mean, not personally, we are in bioMATTERS, you know. I get this question a lot about aesthetics. And this is when people get me, and, you know, and I don't have many answers. That they get me in the aesthetics and they get me in the bioethics, I have to say. And I still don't have, you know, answers for, I have to say.
I think, I mean, when you look to a lot of the very most interesting ideas in this space, they are still ideas, because we haven't had the chance to build them yet, because this is not just obviously making the thing. Well, it's actually not even making the thing. It's co-making the thing with living systems. Those systems have their own agency. So it's, as you say, a lot of the experiments are not going to work out. And really the emphasis of your work is on the process. It's on the materiality. It's not on necessary aesthetics. But as Claudia Pasquero has pointed out, I mean, her project for the Venice Biennale was absolutely beautiful. I mean, this was the stuff of a wallpaper magazine spread. It could absolutely compete with, you know, the highest caliber of visual design in the world. And it does, there is a point to it, because as designers, as creatives, you know that unless it looks good, a lot of people are not going to engage with it, because we are, as a species, it is wired in us as a species to be very, very visual. We use it in all sorts of ways we understand and we don't understand. So the visual side is important. As you say, it's easy to, you know, to sort of concentrate too much on that. But within our space, it's exciting because, you know, we're at this stage when we genuinely don't really know quite what this is going to look like, because we're not actually sure how these processes are going to manifest, you know, things over time. And then even when that does happen, I was saying to Audrey in our last chat that one of the other great things about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, historically, when you create something, a designer piece, let's say, it could be a piece of furniture, art, decor, it is, if you're pricing it at the high end, if it's being sold to the high end market, it's being sold as a collectible, and it's being sold to keep, and it's being sold essentially as an heirloom, for want of a better word. But of course, with the biodesign world and biomaterials, they by their very nature are created to be biodegradable. And so as a value proposition, that is different. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on the sort of the value proposition of biodesign? It's a difficult
question. I mean, we were being interviewed last week and the journalist was asking us about, okay, so, you know, people are they like to grill biodesigners a lot, I have to say.
My apologies if I'm doing that now.
The work, because it has to be, you know, the footprint and the life cycle assessment, and you are using less energy, and you're using and you do this and then this. Okay, so prove it to me. It's more like that. It's like so difficult to justify your designs. I mean, really. But yeah, so it's difficult to put a price tag on it. I mean, honestly, I was just, they were asking me, so do you sell your pieces? And no, I can't sell my pieces because we can't scale this, because we are not doing this full time, you know, and I'm pricing it as a work of art. This is how I'm pricing it. You know, there is none like it. I grow it. It takes me a lot of time to grow it. There is this scaling. I mean, so these are the factors and challenges of biodesigners: the scale, time, and predictability. So waiting for a particular organism to grow is challenging and wonderful at the same time, right? It's not like working with, you know, inert materials like clay or wood, right? So there is a need to create the ideal conditions. So there is a need to create an incubator. There is a need to care for that living system. There is a need for this environment to be set up, temperature, light. There is an amount of care. There is a lot of unpredictability. So there is a lot of things that you can't control. So there is this completely different way of designing that, you know, has a price. I have to say, you know, you need to price things differently. You can't price it just, you know, an Excel sheet of, you know, material sourcing, labor, blah 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 blah. No, it has to be expensive, I have to say. I'm sorry. And there is no standards and no tables for this. Like, you know, like you are an architect, there is a table for your fees, right? So there are no tables for biodesign, you know. So, you know, it is like still a very, how do you say, and law world, Far East. I mean, yeah, we don't know yet. There is no precedence, you know.
There's no template. Yeah, you know, I mean, it strikes me, this is a question I've thought about a lot, because I genuinely think that a lot of the very most important work, it is very difficult to price. If you're working within the traditional framework, it's not difficult to price if you think outside of that framework. And it strikes me that what we really need now, both within this arena and others, is we need patrons. We need people that want to sponsor the Leonardo da Vinci's of this age, the people that are pioneering really important ideas, that are actually solving and tackling design questions, but not in a way that is like, well, I mean, yes, university sponsorships and bursaries and so forth are important, but more in the sense that we need a sort of a system that can identify this talent, can actually help to fund it, and in understanding that it's like academia in the sense that it's about actually creating things that are valuable, but what it's not about is about creating academic papers. It's not necessarily about publishing, because when you're creating genuinely pioneering things, that process might, as you say, take years. And if you're constantly trying to publish that work, not only are you in effect giving away all of what you're working towards, but
Absolutely.
you're not necessarily going to have anything important to publish. So you need to have, you need to have extensive timelines. And that takes a lot of humility to actually sponsor someone or a group of people without the expectation that you're going to have a tangible thing. But I think it is possible. I think this is possible because there are a lot of people that obviously do sponsor things in goodwill and that don't necessarily see a lot back for it. So I do hope that there is a change in thinking. But I think this is an important question for our community, because there is a cost to doing what our community does, isn't there? You know, there is buying all of the equipment. There is the fact that actually a lot of what you create is not necessarily saleable unless it's being sold as a piece of art. And so there has to be something, new happen here. So I guess in a sense, it's understandable that because this is such a pioneering field, we're having to think about the restructuring of everything, not just what it is that we're directly working on, but we're having to think about economics, about finance. I mean,
this is research, and that's why you get, you know, biodesigners doing startups and finding funding, and that's about research grants, and so that, you know, this work is new, is pioneer, has to be funded by research, you know. So it's very research based, and all the startups actually are coming out of universities with PhD students, master students that then decide to do, you know, startup companies. But definitely there's a lot. I mean, I see that with my students. I mean, they get jobs, you know, easily because there's high demand for that, and there is biotech industry. I mean, it's huge, and so I see a lot of potential, I mean, for it, and demand.
Yeah. There is definitely demand for certain skills. I think I just hope that what doesn't happen is, obviously what we've seen in architecture for now decades is you have students produce incredibly thought-provoking ideas when they're in school, and they go out and they're basically stuck doing, you know, not making the tea, but all of that talent is essentially lying latent because they're not able to develop it. And it does, I guess it worries me that, you know, students are often getting out of college with a lot of debt. These times are expensive. Obviously, property is expensive. The cost of living is expensive. So there is that imperative to obviously earn enough money to live. And, you know, that means getting a full-time job. And sometimes getting a full-time job really does obviously limit the amount of time that these really creative and talented young people, and not just young people, but obviously people of all ages, can actually put into their own ideas.
That's definitely an issue. It's been an issue, I think, across creative industries, let's just say, creative industries in general. I mean, students do amazing work in schools, and this is the big debate about bridging also education and industry. That's always an ongoing issue. I mean, how do we do that? And so Centro San Juan is a great place. We do a lot of industry-sponsored projects. We really try to bridge these two worlds. It's different projects. So, you know, academically, I like to have both, more conceptual work and more commercially driven work. I think both is important for everyone, for the industry, for educators, and for students. But yeah, we can be free in school. I mean, yeah, and we can do amazing creative work, but then the world is not ready for it. And that's why I like to think that biodesign is a course that, you know, is allowing for how do I say, feasible, okay, let me choose the word carefully, feasible, sustainable innovation. Okay. That's why I like to think, because you can have critical design and speculative design that then is not science-based. And I find this, you know, this is the difference, you know. And we can create something really futuristic and creative, and I think sometimes you have to forget about what is possible to achieve that. But then, you know, there is a moment we have to merge what is feasible and what can we achieve within scientific, you know, trends, you know, and negotiating this is incredibly difficult, and it's something we do constantly with the students. You know, I'd rather have a project that it's not so out there, that it's kind of feasible, and it's, you know, something that I can implement in 10 years time, than having something, you know, really incredible and stimulating, but then, you know, it's not rooted within, you know, science and you know.
Yeah. As you say that, I'm thinking to the Volvo architecture competition finalists, you know, the sort of the floating mountains with skyscrapers on top and things like that. I'm thinking it looks visually wonderful for a sci-fi film. It's spot on. But when we're living in an age in which the climate trajectories, whether it's the best or worst case, are scary. Biodiversity loss is huge. Microplastics pollution, likewise. You know, we have to make that balance, don't we, of actually having those amazing ideas and then actually tackling the real world problems. So I've got a few questions that are more about the futures in this space. So what do you think are the most profound impacts that biodesign, biocomputing and biofabrication can make to society?
So it's something that, you know, everybody talks about, certainly in architecture schools, you know, increasing levels of consumption, you know, with more people in the world, you know, wanting more resources, resource intensive stuff cannot happen indefinitely, right? So this is what, you know, triggered the need for alternatives, you know, less energy intensive systems. Let's not waste so many raw materials. So for me, that's really important. Less water, less material, less energy. So this is what I think is the underlying kind of aim, at least the way I see it in my practice and in my teaching. So it's guided by this. I mean, if we can start by this, you know, we can't, I mean, materials are not indefinite, you know, we cannot continue manufacturing things. We cannot continue manufacturing plastics. I mean, it's just, that's how I see the big, okay, so how do we stop this? How can we find alternatives for this? So this is kind of like how we start thinking about mitigating, regenerating, bioremediating. So these are kind of like, let's just say, what guides the workflows in biodesign.
And how do you see the kind of concepts that we're talking about and we're working with scaling? So for example, at the moment, when we look to the companies that are, you know, working with biodesign, for example, furniture companies and companies that are making products that are biodesign, we find on the one hand, we've got those companies that are trying to scale at an industrial size. So we've got the biomes, we've got biomason, we've got companies that are attracting very large amounts of money on the sort of the premise that the investors in those companies will benefit when those companies manage to create, if you like, factories, these big scale decentralized places where the likes of fungi bricks and insulation panels and so on are made. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got, I know here on Instagram, there are many accounts of people that are doing exactly what we have done in the past, which is learn how to do these things through experimentation or through online tutorials, give it a go at home, and then actually do it for themselves. Do you see both those areas actually scaling, or do you see a mix, or how do you think that biodesign and biomateriality is going to scale in society?
I really think it comes from who you are as a person. What are your, you know, what are your moral conducts? Your, you know, how do you want to guide your ethos? Let's just say this is how I think it will work. I think we'll see this new generation. It's super exciting for me to teach because I see this new generation with a genuine interest of changing, you know, design and the world. I see them generally interested in protecting biodiversity, you know, protecting the planet. So I think that's really great news. So I see these things as a kind of emerging movement. It will come naturally. It will be an organic process. And so this is how I'm very optimistic and very, I don't know, maybe romantic, but I like to think that you'll be a natural change. And then it will be small businesses in the beginning, you know, small studios doing that and doing some really exciting work. And then the big studios, I mean, the people that are doing concrete stuff, you know, the big people with lots of money. I mean, Neri Oxman is doing that already. She's giving up academia. She's doing her own studio, and she's going to be one of those that are really doing it and scaling it up. But it will start like that. We'll start, you know, from very small startups, small studios, people that are very passionate, and I think every designer needs to be an eco activist. That's how I think it will change. So hopefully, you know, I have students really worried about, oh, Nancy, do you think if I come to biodesign, I can get a job in other companies that are not so interested in biodesign? And I'm like, what are you talking about? You have to be interested in working for the biodesign companies, not worry that you will not get a job, because there's a lot of them that are not still there. I mean, there's a lot of greenwashing as well. So the big companies are ticking the boxes. They want to have these biodesigners because they want to look good. So there will be the genuine ones, the fake ones, in between ones. And I think it just will be a natural process. I mean, there's not that I'm evangelizing, by the way. I hate that. And I don't like to think about that. We are creating this cult, you know, at CSM, and we are all, I mean, it will take time. It will be a transition. It's not possible to do everything bio-based and super sustainable, you know. It's not going to work. I mean, we don't have the solutions yet. We need to design for this, you know, transition time. We have to couple the artificial and the sustainable, and we have to live with this transition for a while. And then, you know, we need to allow for technology to evolve, because the technology is still not there. The tools are not there. You have to invent everything, you know. You have to invent new machines, new ways of working. You have to hire scientists, the chemists. You have to hire, you know, a computational science. You have to hire an architect. So you have to hire very different people and to make this happen. And this takes time and money. And so it will take time. But yeah, I see first of all, someone that really wants to change the world. You know, you need to be that kind of person and to go through that tough process. So, because it's not easy, but like any designer, you know, if you think about the revolutionary people in design and artists, they were incredibly strong people. You know, you have to be super tough. I mean, I always tell my students, go and see art. I mean, Bridget Riley, I was in an exhibition like last year at the Hayward Gallery, I think. And I was looking into the trajectory of her work. It was incredible. I mean, it's unbelievable. You have to see, you know, in order to make a masterpiece, you need to work years and years and years. And it was really beautiful because you can see all the drawings and you could see all that she had to do. And it was so precise and so rigorous. And, you know, design and artists, they don't do pretty things. They are incredibly rigorous. It's not about making pretty things. It's not about hiring the architects at the end and make pretty things and make beautiful drawings and communication. No. Designers are not like that. We are super rigorous, you know, in how we do things. And
I mean, it strikes me that, you know, I mentioned Leonardo da Vinci earlier, and when we look back to, you know, the pre-Newtonian era, to that period when really pretty much all the pioneers I can think of, certainly within the period of the Enlightenment, the Italian Renaissance, the Renaissance in Britain, and indeed across all of Europe, the individuals that were leading that, they were at least comfortable, if not talented, in a number of different fields. And what I really like about biodesign is that as a community, I'd struggle to think of a single biodesigner that isn't actually hands-on, that doesn't have the capacity to actually, you know, get their hands dirty with this. Because there was a time in design, you know, when the whole thing became remote. So when computerized design came in, it was very much, yes, you might create an analog sketch, but essentially you would, you know, you create the pattern, you might do that digital or by hand, and then or the blueprint, and then you load it up to a computer, and everything that happened after that was out of your hands. I remember I was, one of my work placements was with a wetsuit company, and Karl Lagerfeld was one of the the clients. He basically was using the supplier, and we just had his sketches come through. And then after that process, literally the whole collection, which was of neoprene, was made with him just sort of commenting on what was being made. You know, he wasn't there hands on. And now obviously he was an iconic designer, and I'm not in any way questioning his brilliance as a creative professional. But if there was an era when, for many, many designers and architects, that whole process, it was out of their hands. They were the conceptualizer. And now with biodesign, it's getting back to that. You've got to almost be the engineer, and that you've got to physically understand these systems, even if it does come to a point where, you know, biodesign is an industrialized process, and you've sort of crafted that formula, if you like, and the conditions that will make the piece that you want to co-create with the organism. Right now, this is, you know, roll your sleeves up, get your overalls or your lab coat on and do it. And
Absolutely,
I really like that about it.
Yeah, I was just thinking about my process, but but it also, you have to study, and you have to research your stuff, you know. You have to go deep into, you know, if you're saying, okay, my practice is inspired by biology or by nature, you know, what is that? You have to really, I mean, especially now, I mean, there's all these things about biomimetic design, biomimicry design, biological inspired design. You know, you have to really start understanding language. You have to start understanding natural processes. You have to really go deep into it. Otherwise, you know, it just lacks, it's just superficial, like you said, you know, it's just superficial and lacks depth, and it lacks knowledge, you know. I mean,
yeah, I mean, you know, Rachel Armstrong and I, we've had a few chats about, you know, how, I mean, biomimicry as a domain, you know, it's an incredible area because there's so much potential there, but there is a lot of superficiality. The thing I particularly hate are the bullet points about what say nature is, or nature is collaborative, not competitive. You think, well, actually, that's pretty easy to undo. In fact, we could undo that in a minute if we were talking about things like parasitic insects, or, you know, we were talking about the sort of the fight for survival on the plains of Africa, you know. There are a lot of analogies and a lot of statements about nature that are completely untrue, but you can't get away with that in biodesign, because if you, in effect, if you make the wrong assumption in biodesign, as you say, your experiment will go wrong, and you won't end up with anything tangible. I mean, you'll learn from the process, but you can't make with nature if you don't really understand
absolutely,
how it
you
works.
really have to. And this is why, I mean, it's exciting to work with scientists, because then it can teach you a lot of, you know, amazing concepts. This is what, I mean, I like most. I mean, for example, Biodesign, they have biology lectures. They really understand, you know, what are DNA? What are the blocks of life? How do you study cell biology? And then they go to the lab and really look into the microscope. I mean, that alone, you know, it's just super stimulating for a designer to understand what is under the microscope. How do you understand these structures? Then how do you start about thinking about morphogenesis, right? How do you start thinking about nature patterns and processes? This is not just looking at pretty pictures, you know. And so, you know, you start being super inspired by these processes, and then you start developing your own language, your own aesthetic. And this is how I like to think about my process. I mean, and the good news is that a lot of people have written about this. This is nothing new, okay? You know, architects have been thinking about since the 60s. There's lots of papers. I mean, we give lots of readings to the students. They learn how to distill science and then, you know, translate it into design language. And so this is what's so exciting, but there is a need to understand what you're talking about. You know, a little bit of chemistry helps. So there are all these blocks we try to curate at the Biodesign course. And we really think that, you know, it's a formal way of teaching and learning, and not just, you know, like myself, you know, I just started reading about it and I started experimenting it. So how you start curating this curriculum, and how do you sequence it? You know, how do you familiarize students to going to a lab? You know, it's super intimidating in the beginning. And it's really beautiful how, you know, after 2 years, they are so confident. They have so much knowledge about biology and science, and they become really confident about it. And then, you know, and then when they leave, it's just the start of their journey, you know. And this is something that, you know, students don't think about. They think, oh, you know, my final project, I want to do this really ambitious project. No, you're just going to start it right here, and then you will, you know, you'll develop it later on, but build on it. Yeah.
Build on it. So I've got, we've gone over time. I've got just 2 more questions, Nancy. Now, these are questions I'm asking everyone in the series because I'm going to collate the answers when we've come to the end of this series. So, Nancy, the first question is, the year is 2050. What does the biomaterialized world look and
such a
feel
difficult
like?
question. I don't have a question, but I have an answer, but hopefully less plastically. I don't know how to say it. But I really think I can't really visualize it that much in terms of materiality, but it will be definitely this kind of living materiality. So everything will be not so polished, perhaps. So the aesthetics will be more like this living materiality in terms of, you know, how things will be conceived, I think. So it will be most of all this paradigm change between, you know, human nature relationships, you know, where the natural processes are less controlled, you know, like we've been doing up until now. So less instrumentalization of human nature relationships into something that will be more about entangling, you know, human and artificial systems, which is also, you know, something that I think it's very superficial the way we talk about these things. You know, I don't think we can put at the same level nature and ecology and artificial systems, because nature is above. You know, nature is the context for ecology and artificial. So I think, you know, there needs to be a much more developed conversation about this. Because nature has been experimenting for billions and millions and billions of years, you know, to refine this evolutionary moment where we find ourselves now, right? And then as humans, we are quickly degrading, right? So now, since humans have already started, you know, causing this irreparable change, you know, to climate systems, ecosystems. So now it's time for us to create this new theory. So this is how I think about I mean, it's not that long. It's like 25 years from now, 28 years from now. It's not that much when you think about the history of the planet. So it will be the beginning of the transition into something more.
Something else. You know, one of the things that I think about in this, because one of the things that often when a lot of people talk about nature, and when you see images that are, so say, nature inspired online, a lot of it is all very pretty. It's the very nice, you know, we love the concept of nature. Admittedly, I'm one of those people that if somebody says the word nature to me, I instantly think of flowers and trees and bunnies and all the lovely things. But actually, nature can be quite a cruel place. It's and it's a place of life and death. And you know, most of the people that have influenced my own work, people like Lebbeus Woods and Jane Jacobs and so on, they've really thought about that end process and about death. And I think that for us within the global north tends to be difficult, because unlike some of the cultures of the indigenous world, where death, you know, the idea of death, for example, in Native American cultures, is that the spirit will never die. You know, you can call up your spirits, a bit like we've dialed up one another today. So death is not a sort of a scary place, and your ancestors are with you, they're not gone. Whereas in the West, we have a very different idea of death. I mean, obviously, since, you know, the early Christian era, we've had sort of increasingly, well, you know, if you're good, you go to heaven, if you're bad, you go to hell, and it will be an eternal hell, and there'll be purgatory, and it's all horrible. And in a sense, we came to a point of feeling very dis at ease with death. But actually, death is a very important part of design, and it's something that now, as a designer, you have to think about the end of the product, the end of the thing, which is actually the new beginning. So it's the new cycle. So, you know, when I think of this sort of future city, I think it, you know, it's one of the reasons it can be kind of hard to pin it down is because as a community, we are thinking about these things that are they're bigger than the physicality of the product. They're actually spiritual, they're ideological, they're holistic, they're all these big things, but they are things that, you know, ultimately we will come to reintegrate, and we are reintegrating into design and into the world that we imagine, that we build. But that we're really, again, we're having to start from ground zero, because what we're coming from, which is essentially modernism and the industrialized world, took a very different approach, didn't it? You know, things were created and then they were thrown away, and nobody bothered to think about where they were being thrown to.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's important that we think about, well, it's important we look at data. This is something I'm always talking about in my teaching, in my practice. Data-driven design has been something that I've been all along as part of my process. I mean, it's important to look at the data. I mean, the US and Great Britain, like, you know, the United Kingdom alone, these two nations, their footprint, ecological footprint of consumption is 3 times to 5 times more than the rest of the other nations. I mean, so commutatively, these two nations have ways of living that are deeply, deeply unsustainable. You know, just look at these. I mean, and I think that's, you know, education in general. If you look at that, I mean, it's just quite shocking. And this is something, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, of course, because we are here, people that are deeply interested in, you know, ecological thinking and making. But I think there is a need to shout about this. And we look at, I mean, even now, I mean, every day we see news. I mean, plastics are in our bloodstreams now, you know, it's just undeniable. So for future generations, I mean, there are, you know, incredible, dramatic consequences for future generations. I mean, it's just like that. And so it's about structural choice. It's about structural choices.
It is shocking, you know.
And
I suppose in a sense, you know, thankfully we have this data now. I mean, I know certainly with microplastics, yes, you're absolutely, they're in the bloodstream. We know that they inhibit fertility. We know that they're carcinogenic in some cases. They can be cancer causing. We know at least 2 species of fish have been made infertile by tire wear alone. And that study, well, the study near Seattle, where they found that an indigenous species of salmon had become infertile, but more specifically because when there was high precipitation, when there was high rainfall, the tire wear that ran off from the roads that collected over time and then went into the rivers was so toxic and in such quantity that it's literally made the fish infertile. And, you know, when you think about these incredibly scary statistics, there could be no greater imperative to completely redesign how we're doing things. So there is no doubt that biodesign has a very important part to play.
That's why I think it's in every school's agenda, it's in every curriculum. They all talk about this. We all want to generate these superhuman beings in the future to save the planet.
Hopefully we will. So your final question, Nancy. I want you to imagine that you are in a lab or in your studio and you have one wish because a genie has popped out of a magical lamp or out of a test tube or out of a petri dish, and they've granted you one wish for the future of biomateriality and biodesign. What would it be, Nancy?
I mean, I always like to, I was thinking about this. I mean, I think there is a paper, I was thinking about this this morning when I was preparing more or less very fast. But, you know, I run a seminar in year 1, it's called Mapping Biodesign. And so what this seminar is basically, we go through readings with students and we discuss the readings. It's give them, you know, an introduction of what is biodesign. So, and there is one paper that I think is really good. It's ecological theory in design. I think that's what I think it's important. And if anyone in this audience wants to really start thinking about this, I think it's a good starting point. And it kind of like gives a you know, goes to the history of ecological thought and theories and philosophies. So it's a really good introduction to the evolution of how did we arrive here in biodesign and why is this something important. And I think my wish is really about, you know, instilling this into, you know, people, you know, designers concerned with sustainability is, you know, ecological literacy. That's what I want. That's what I would like, you know, people to take interest in that, to educate themselves into. So it's not that I want, I mean, if I had someone that would come in and fulfill my wishes, it's not about money, you know, it's not about, but it's about societal change and how we can increment societal change, and how we can start balancing, you know, this industry world, you know, into more ecologically balanced world, you know, more in balance with the environment, with ecosystems, with the planet. So that would be my goal, really, is how we start ecological literacy.
So ecological
Informing
literacy, people being aware
informing
of
people,
the
educating
consequences
people,
of their
informing
action.
people, and having these perspectives. So how can we have this collective, you know, interest to change the way we live, the way we use materials, the way we consumption. So it's about ecological literacy. And so this is this paper is called Ecological Theory in Design: Participant Designers in an Age of Entanglement, by Joanna Bohenhert. I think she's great. She's been writing. Oh, you know her?
I know, yeah, I know Jodie. Yeah, because yeah, I know Jodie because actually we met at Greengaged by the Design Council years ago. I think that was 2009, and that we were both pre-PhD then. And yeah, and then Jodie and I remember actually Jodie and I both separately pitched. This was actually for some funding. We both had concepts, and that we both had a nightmare because we both of us sat separately. Jodie had one project, I had another, before it was basically an all-male panel. And I remember I was pretty horrified because in my panel session, when I was pitching, I realized that the chair hadn't even bothered to read my CV. And at that point, I just realized, well, I'm wasting my time even being here. And Jodie and I both came out and we had a little chat. And I said, oh, you know, I don't think it's probably gone that well. And she was, and then after that, about a month later, we found out that a guy had won it. And about 3 months later, we found out that the guy had spent all the money and achieved nothing. And so for both of us, it was a bit of a bitter experience. But yeah, Jodie's a member of the Design Research Society, and her work is great. So I would absolutely recommend Jodie's work. Yeah, she's an absolute pioneer in her field, and you know, a really deeply committed individual.
I mean, after I talk about systems design thinking, I always give this paper to my students to read. I think it's a great introduction to ecological thought, you know, ecological thought. So
yeah, and she's very, I think another good quality about Jodie and about a lot of people in this field is that we're very honest. You know, we are, I don't usually call myself an activist, but I certainly have been a campaigner, and I'm outspoken. And I think when you see the data that we do in our community, when you see the harm that is being done, when you see the urgency, and we see the potential for change, just how many alternative ways there are to create and to, you know, to run our society, you can't be anything but. And I think that's one of the qualities. And so I'm, you know, really glad to hear about all the work you're doing with your students. I know they speak very highly of you because I've had a couple of DMs. So I know that they really value the work you do. And it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, Nancy. Thank you for making the time.
Great because it makes me think, you know, it's great we have these conversations, Melissa. Thanks for grilling me. No.
Well, thank you for the questions. I will be getting together the insights. And
enjoyed it too.
Yeah,
thanks for everyone that's logged in. I can see
absolutely.
Some names here. My students, yes, Hannah, and some of them here. That's great. Thanks, guys.
And so everyone knows we will have a recording of this, because I know it's gone on quite a long time. So we will have a recording. I've actually I gave a lecture remotely to students in Hanoi yesterday, and some of them were keen to watch, but obviously they're in a different time zone. So I know that we have a few people already lined up to watch the video that I think they'll probably be in bed right now, given the time zone. And we will hopefully catch up again.
Absolutely.
And most definitely when in London,
yes,
for a drink, and we'll put the world to rights.
Some others we need to get you soon. Whenever you are in London, you're back in London, we'll have to arrange that, Melissa. Thanks for the invitation.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everybody for joining us.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed it.